Welcome to the Special Events Studio. I am Scott North, Sales Manager for TO Live. I work with private, non-ticketed events coming into our three venues in the City of Toronto: Meridian Hall in the St. Lawrence Centre downtown, Meridian Arts Centre uptown. We are back after hiatus and rebooting to the original intent of this podcast. We will tell the stories belonging to the players in the event industry, how they got started, their journeys with stops along the way, their tales of the interesting, exciting, and captivating elements of the event world. Welcome to the Special Events Studio. Hello, I'd like to welcome you back to the Special Events Studio podcast. We're coming back to you after a long hiatus. We've had some staffing changes, personnel changes. We're still in the pandemic. But the first thing I want to do is welcome Wakfan Yukobo to our podcast as a new producer and actually also the social media specialist at TO Live. Wakfan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Scott. Happy to be here.
So Wakfan takes care of us technically, makes sure everything's running well, and then does all post-production as well. But Wakfan, again, welcome. We'll get right to it. I'd like to welcome our first guest back after the hiatus. It's Matt Farrell, Vice President of Operations for TO Live. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Scott. Thanks for having me.
So, Matt, TO Live, so for folks that don't know out there, TO Live manages the three City of Toronto theaters: downtown Meridian Hall and St. Lawrence Centre, uptown Meridian Arts Centre. Now, you're responsible for all operations of those three venues, through three different locations. That's a pretty big job. How did you get there? And let's start post-secondary. Did you go to post-secondary school?
I did, yes. I went to the Ryerson Theatre School, is what it was called at the time at Ryerson. And there I studied technical production. So everything related to backstage is where I focused 4 years of my post-secondary career.
Perfect. And so you're going in there. What kind of ideas did you have as to job prospects once you got out of there?
It's interesting. Depending on what stream you wanted to go, that would somewhat depended on where the jobs may or may not be. And by streams, I'm talking about when you're looking at things backstage. Did you want to focus on the management side? Did you want to focus on lighting, sound, wardrobe, stage management, those sorts of things? And what kind of is a ebb and flow of the industries. There tends to be peaks and valleys of where certain areas may be looking for more people, and a lot of that is somewhat technologically driven. For example, when there was a big bit of a paradigm shift in digital technology, so for quite a while, people who knew digital audio consoles and digital lighting consoles, they were very much in hot demand. And so those folks who were able to adopt to that technology sooner ultimately were able to get the jobs faster. I went into the technical direction, production management side of things. That's where my interest lied. And from there, I was frankly very lucky in that I was able to secure a series of jobs right out of Ryerson.
So So nothing like, there wasn't a dream job going in and then did you not achieve it? You're going in to get yourself a job and you got jobs right out of university.
That's right. Yes.
So what kind of gigs did you get?
Well, like a lot of my jobs, they were seated while I was at university. When I was in my second year, I think, at Ryerson, I spent my summers at the Blythe Festival, my second and third year, I think it was. And at the Blythe Festival, it's a fantastic summer stock theater festival in rural Ontario. Blythe is a very, very small town, very picturesque town, but it has a very, very live and vibrant community that really rallies around the theater festival in the summer. And so my first 2 years there, I was a production assistant, and that's very much where you learn to work really hard for not a lot of money. I think I was making all of $250 a week, and then room and board was taken off of that, or at least board was taken off that. But in the end, the experiences were invaluable. It felt, in some ways, a little like summer camp, in that you were there with a lot of younger people who were just having a great job making theater. And the theater we were making, we were very, very proud at the time. And to this day, they're still, for a summer stock theater in Ontario, it ranks up there with one of the best, in my opinion.
So where's Blythe?
Blythe, it's near the shores Lake Huron, somewhat near Godrich, about I think it's half an hour or 45 minutes from London, kind of that neck of the woods.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and it's totally separate from Stratford, let's
No,
say.
yeah, nothing other than it's a 45-minute drive from Stratford. Nothing to do with Stratford at all. No.
Okay, and I my lack of culture is coming out because I knew certainly of Stratford. I did not know of Blythe. Very interesting. Okay, so you nice. That's a gig, and like a lot of us, we straight out of university, college, we were not making a lot of money. You did that, but you're kind of getting your feet wet and learning that business. What did that turn into?
Well, in where my first year at Blythe, I was the production assistant. My last year at Blythe, I was the technical director, and at the time, I had just finished my final year at Ryerson. And then at the time, this would have been 1998, 97, I think, in our mailboxes, because there wasn't a lot of email floating around back then. But in our mailbox, there was a little note, and in it, the note said, "Please call Bruce McMullen at the Canadian Opera Company." So that's a very interesting note to get for a young technical director. I knew who Bruce was. Bruce actually taught me technical direction at Ryerson. But I called him up, and sure enough, he said that they were looking for an associate technical director at the Canadian Opera Company. And I drove down to Toronto one afternoon, and interviewed him. And it was about a week or so after I finished my Blythe contract. I was starting at the Canadian Opera Company as the associate technical director. So that, as you can imagine, is going from a fantastic, as I said, fully professional, still very very uh, summer camp type environment at the Blythe Festival, to becoming the associate technical director of the Canadian Opera Company. So there, it was a tremendous learning experience that I was able to get from Bruce. Bruce was a very, very seasoned technical director. He had worked all over the States. He came up into Canada. And that is really where, if I had a good rudimentary knowledge of it before, working with him really helped me refine that expertise, as well as probably the biggest thing he taught me was working with union crews, because the Canadian Opera Company at the time was performing. It was at the time the Hummingbird Center, which is now, of course, Meridian Hall. That's really where I had learned a lot of the skills and soft skills necessary to be able to work in that environment.
The Canadian Opera Company operated out of what is now Meridian Hall for a while. They were a resident company there.
Decades, yeah, absolutely, yeah, a long time. And then when they built Four Seasons Center in early 2000s, 2005, something like that, that's when they moved over there.
Okay, so that they built the Four Seasons Center for the Canadian Opera Company.
Yeah. The Canadian Opera Company essentially built it for themselves, and the National Ballet of Canada is a tenant of theirs in there. So what were the two main tenants of the Hummingbird, Sony, Meridian Hall, uh, left and went over to a new building.
I didn't realize that. So Hummingbird Center, Sony Center. Sorry, O'Keefe Center, Hummingbird Center, Sony Center, Meridian Hall. It's had a long history. We're at Meridian Hall now, but so at one point that it had the Canadian Opera Company and the National Ballet that performed in it throughout the season every year.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. And again, it was for decades.
Is that right? Yep. Very interesting. That would have been a much different world in the Meridian Hall, wouldn't it?
When they left, Meridian Hall had to reinvent itself at the time to figure out how is it going to be able to be relevant when there aren't two principal tenants in it. And so we are right now what I would hope is kind of the right at the peak of finally figuring out how we are redefining the building under the umbrella, of course, of TO Live.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So the career of Matt Farrell got off to a nice start. After the Canadian Opera Company, where did you go then?
Well, I was at the Canadian Opera Company. Well, it was, as you said, learning a lot about specifically how to work in that large scale environment that was an opera company. I was at the same time missing some of that grassroots theater that I had previously been in. So the Young People's Theater was looking for a technical director. And again, the production manager at the time called me up, asked me to come over for an interview. We had a great conversation, and I decided to kind of take a take a little move down the street because Young People's Theater is just down the street from Meridian Hall, and I was at Young People's Theater for 5 or 6 years as their technical director.
Okay.
Yep.
So heavy technical director, and then I'm sure there's a couple other stops before
That's right. Yes.
Sony Center.
Yeah. And so while at the while at Young People's Theater, Soul Pepper Theater Company. This was before they had their current home. They were just starting to get going at the Harbourfront Center. And they wanted to use Young People's Theater scenic shop, wardrobe shop, and prop shop in order to build all of their sets, props, and costumes. Um, because I was somewhat foolish at the time, single at the time, and again, just craving as much exposure as I could. I ultimately ended up being their technical director throughout the summer months by taking my vacation, taking my loo time, working evenings and things like that, so that I could essentially hold down two jobs at the same time, with Soul Pepper at the time being seasonal. So I was with them for a few years until they built the Young Center for the Performing Arts. And when they built that new building down in the Distillery District, that's where I ended up deciding to leave YPT because there was a full time job waiting for me at Soul Pepper / the Young Center for the Performing Arts. And so I was their technical director at the time, both for the building and for the company. And I ended up again doing that for another 3, 4, 5 years, something like that. Ultimately becoming the production manager for Soul Pepper.
And then it was to Sony Center?
Not quite yet. No, we still aren't there. I went and decided I wanted a bit of a change in how I was approaching my career. So I actually went to work for a corporate uh, theater equipment, concert equipment rental company. I only stayed there for 3 months because, as it turns out, that is not the change I was looking for. And so then I went out on my own and I became a freelance production manager, technical director around town. And I worked for companies big and small as a production manager, technical director. And I did that for about 3 or 4 years, where I was just, had a PMTD for hire, and I went wherever the jobs did, and that was great. That was fun. I really, really enjoyed it. But the one thing that was really stressful is that kind of always looking ahead in the calendar to see where am I not going to have income? Do I have enough money saved up from the previous gig to make it through a dry spell? And at the same time, my first child was on the way, and then that's where I just couldn't take that stress, didn't want to take that stress. So I found a job, oddly enough, back at another corporate AV type company. The only difference was this was less about purely getting gear out the door into another company's hands, and we very much were making the shows ourselves. So I was a production manager for this company, and companies would come to us not just necessarily to look to rent a piece of equipment A, B, C, and D, but they want to put on a corporate AGM. They want to do a gala dinner, those things like that. And so we were really thought that production managers there were very much involved in the planning. We got to do some design, and it was really a much more encompassing and frankly really rewarding job. And so I was there for about 5 years doing that.
Awesome. And the purpose, we've kind of reinvented ourselves on this podcast as well, as where when we first started it, the pandemic had just started, And so we got into talking about life around the pandemic, and you know what, we got tired of that, and well, I mean, we had some personnel changes, this, that, pandemic still going on. So this, when we start back up, Matt being our first guest, we wanted to get an idea of, how is it that you've come to be in the position that you're in now? Kind of the journey of people within the event industry. And you know what, Matt, it's good information to have too, because now I understand how you've been able to jump into different events. You've been able to help me with corporate events, and basically kind of oversee or even take over if necessary. I did not realize where that information and experience came from. So, this podcast is serving its purpose for helping me out with a colleague. So thank you for that.
Not a problem.
So now, how did you get from all of that to, at the time, what was a Sony Center?
So the company that I was working for, it ended up being bought by a similar company, and so there was a bit of a merge there. And during that time, the company I was working for was a company that was bought. And long story short, it didn't work out well for everybody, myself included. So I ended up suddenly realizing that I needed to find another job. Fortunately, at the time, the Sony Center at the time, the current CEO was actually an interim CEO because he had just taken over from the previous CEO, but he was also the director of programming at the Sony Center. So he was doing two jobs. He was the interim CEO of the Sony Center and the director of programming. As the director of programming, he had a number of different departments under him at the Sony Center, including production, box office, merchandise, and pure programming. So they were looking for an interim associate director of programming to fill that role. And so the timing just worked out really, really well. I heard on the street that they were looking to fill this. I sent the email off to Mark, and long story short, there within a week of that sending that email off, I landed in the position.
Nice. And so that was a Sony Center then. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you were only in the Sony Center at that
Correct.
time.
Yeah. This was pre-amalgamation of TO Live, so it's just the Sony Center, and it was also a very different job than what I'm doing right now. For Mark, who was the CEO at the time, I was very much looking after everything that wasn't pure programming in terms of booking shows and stuff like that. So I was looking after the other departments within his portfolio, which was box office, merchandising, production, and corporate defense, of course, and which is where we met, Scott.
Perfect. And then your job, your job kind of grew and developed and changed, and so how'd you land the VP spot?
Well, because it was just an interim position, really until things could be figured out in terms of how the CEO's job would work with the programming job. The director of programming at the time was also off on a maternity leave, so I knew when I took the job that there was an expiry date to it. But at the same time, the director of facilities at the time ended up retiring, and the Sony Center ended up borrowing an individual from City of Toronto to fill in for a little bit. But ultimately, as my contract started, you could see the end date. We sat down and we talked, and the conversation was, did I want to take over that director of facilities job? And with that, there was a slight reorg within the company where production also went over to facilities too. So I ended up being in charge of basically the entire building, anything you could touch or look at, capital projects, stuff like that, production, as well as front of house and patron services.
Awesome. And then you went in from that to doing that, all of that with Sony Center. Then when the new Meridian deal came in, how did that evolve?
Well, when uh, th- this was before the Meridian deal. So when I was purely that position with Sony Center, the City of Toronto amalgamated, as we know, Sony Center, Toronto Center for the Arts at the time, and the St. Lawrence Center into what was called at the time Civic Theatres Toronto. And that is where, during that, as part of that amalgamation, I was offered the position of Vice President of Operations. And so At that time, which is where I am now, the portfolio was basically patron services, capital projects, facilities, buildings, all that stuff, as well as food and beverage.
That's a lot on your plate, pun intended. That is a lot. That's a lot of stuff, Matt.
Yes.
Oh.
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so you have all that, and that's going along. You know, did it take a while to kind of feel comfortable in that role with everything that you were taking on? And I'm talking prior to pandemic.
I mean, when the company amalgamated, it was very much like a switch was turned in terms of when everybody ended up moving from their previous positions within three different companies into their new position within one company. For some people, it was more or less a seamless transition. For myself, it went from being in charge of one building to being in charge of three buildings that I knew absolutely nothing about. So that is where there was absolutely a huge change in terms of things you had to come up to speed on very, very fast. And so that it was a challenge at the time, and things were just things were just getting good, and it was just figuring things out when the pandemic hit.
Okay, so and I mean now we are into that again, and it does uh, kind of cover and so much of your job. So pandemic, and I'd like to say I can't imagine how that was going from one venue to three, but I can because I was there. I can't imagine on the level that you had to do that and all that you had to learn. But now you're in the pandemic, and I know from being there again that like it's particularly for the vice president of operations. Uh, how much have you had to like? Did your workload decrease through the pandemic? Let me ask you that first.
Absolutely not. In fact, it absolutely
Absolutely
did
not.
increase. Perhaps the what may be an instinctual reaction is that if shows are not happening in a theater or in three theaters, then surely it must be easier to manage and deal with those theaters. Um, the experience was in fact the complete opposite. For one thing, everything to do with COVID made everything harder, hands down. Another thing, because it was for like so many other restaurants and performing arts companies, it was a financial crisis, bar none. Um, the result of that was that we ended up going down on staff, so we were operating the venues on a skeleton staff, and that was challenging for the entire team. Just to not have their colleagues to rely on, to work with them, and just just purely the number of people that were responsible for almost a million square feet. So that was uh, both of those things were absolutely challenging. But at the same time, we were also doing a lot of capital projects at the three theaters because we had limited activity because of the pandemic. The city, because these buildings are owned by the city of Toronto, they saw this as an opportunity to try to do a bit of catch up on some accessibility projects that we have on the books, as well as some state of good repair backlog to be able to do a series of repairs and improvements and upgrades that previously would not have been would have just taken much pardon me, much longer, because there is because of the limited activity. You can just let that construction blast radius um, expand and encompass the lobbies, encompass the auditoriums, while we're waiting for audiences to come back. For instance, down at Meridian Hall, we substantially increased the amount of accessible seats that are available in the auditorium. Previously, there was really only two spots we could put accessible seats, and there was also a limited number of seats that were available. So our goal was to be able to increase it up to what is desirable under accessibility standards, and to be able to put those seats in a number of different locations. So now we are able to put those accessible seats in multiple locations, more of them, including up in the balcony. So there was, for example, a lift that went up to the balcony. We had to level off parts of the auditorium to be able to create areas that weren't sloped, replace a whole bunch of seats. So all that in a normal time, that could have taken 2 or 3 years because you need to maintain an active theater. What we were able to do was essentially let the construction create a bit of a blast radius and just go and tackle everything at once at the same time. And with that, there is money savings opportunities in there. But most importantly, it's not something that is done piecemeal. It is just something that's done. It's over with. Now that audiences are coming back, they're able to see the benefit of it.
Okay, so I mean, in the midst of all this, we'll take that as a plus, as an advantage that you were able to get all that done.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
honestly, that's probably the one silver lining of the entire pandemic.
okay, I am an optimist, eternal optimist. I'm going to take that
Your
positive.
glass is half full.
So that's that's right. Now, okay, that you've got that going on capital projects, but the big thing, you are the main point person of TO Live, for as the VP of operations, everything that's going on. So any type of restrictions and people coming into our venues, any type of measures put in place to keep people safe. You're in charge of all that.
That's right.
That that has got to be, and particularly in these times, that's got to be a pretty stressful and pretty time consuming position. Just that, and you don't even have to answer that because I know it is. I know that goes without saying. But so with the pandemic, like what kind of measures did you put in place, as you're kind of foreseeing and your executive team is planning to reopen?
The most basic measures are those that appear in the various ever-changing COVID regulations. And in some ways, following those was almost like following a ever-changing instruction manual on how to put put something together. One week you'd have to one type of you'd have to have one requirement in place. A month later, that may not be in place. There might be some other type of requirement in place. So just kind of keeping up with the regulations, what was required, what wasn't required, what was changing. That was constant. Because as we all know, the regulations around COVID were constantly changing, but we were really seeing those regulations as the base level of what we could do. That's kind of like if the minimum standard. But ultimately, we knew that when audience were going to come back, that there was going to be an apprehension, and we wanted to do everything we could to make the audiences, and not just audiences, employees who are coming back, artists who are coming back, performers who are coming back. We want to create an environment that they feel safe, and ultimately is as safe as we can possibly make it. So we ended up doing a number of enhancements that were well above with what just the regulations required. But I think it's something that that will and is paying off in terms of welcoming people back to the building.
Okay, so what kind of what kind of things are in
But
place? If I walked in there now, what's different than before?
well, a lot of what you when you walk in, you may not see too much. So there is a promotional element, and I say that because a lot of where we're have focused our energies and our dollars is on ventilation and air quality. So there's nothing in the regulations that specifically say you have to do this or that related to that. However, with it being well known now that COVID is absolutely airborne, we want to do a number of upgrades to our air handling systems to be able to address that. For example, we've installed UVC lights in all of our ductwork. So what UVC light is it's a form of ultraviolet radiation, and essentially renders the COVID virus and numerous other viruses inert, so that they aren't able to reproduce, they aren't able to infect people. So that as we suck out the old air of the auditorium, for example, ultimately any building is going to have to put a little bit of that air back into the auditorium, and that's just in part the nature of being in Canada. you can't suck out 100% of the air and put in 100% of the air from outside, because you have to heat it, you have to cool it, you essentially have to condition it. So you're always doing a mix of fresh air and the existing building air. The existing building air is, of course, where the concern is. So all of this air passes through these UVC lights, essentially rendering any type of viruses, even molds and stuff like that, inert, and it goes back into the auditorium safely. So that's one example of the things we're doing.
And I know that there are several others, and Matt's just being modest right now. Matt, you talk about the, all the restrictions that are changing, monthly, weekly, daily. You're the person that's responsible for these three venues and all the staff and all the different stakeholders that have anything to do with it. Like, as a regular person trying to follow it, it's extremely confusing. Like, what do you have, like a special bat phone that's direct to the city that they call you and tell you about this, or how do you get this information?
No, it's quite the opposite. Where when the province makes the regulations, there's little very little back channel information that is available. There is a great network of both people who work who are colleagues at the city, as well as at all the other theaters, and we absolutely compare notes, compare best practices, get opinions on how do you read this regulation, this how I read that regulation, those sorts of things. And that's perhaps that is the second silver lining of the pandemic, is that I have become closer to a lot of my colleagues around the city. Not that we were strangers before, but there's definitely a lot more collaboration, a lot more discussion going on than there previously was, as we all try to figure out how to get through this.
Sure. And now we are okay. What's the restrictions right now? I understand. Well, I know that we had a Full House concert this past Saturday. So restrictions are starting to open up, but that's not going to make your job any less busy either, is it?
No, and I think it's almost important to put a bit of a time stamp on the date we're recording this, which is October 20th. Just because a week and a half ago we could only have 50%, about a week and a half ago, we could only have 50% of the auditorium. We're now able to have 100%. So on this show that we had this past Saturday, it had booked a long time ago, and it was holding on, hoping that they would be able to open up to as full of house possible. Originally, we started with I'm forgetting the history now. I think it was that we could open up to 50% capacity originally. So in Meridian Hall, 50% up to 1,000 seats. So in Meridian Hall, they could have had 1,000 people in there. They then went to a full 50%, and then ended up being like 10,000 seats or something like that. So for at Meridian Hall, that means we went from 1,000 seats to somewhere around 1,600 seats. And then about a week out, they completely removed all capacity restrictions. And so then it was pretty much all 3,200 seats were there and available for sale. The show was previously sold out. So all of a sudden, we were stuck in the situation where we had to figure out how to do the vaccine checks of 3,200 people coming into the building, when previously our entire mindset, our entire plan, everything we were thinking of was for about half that.
Okay, how to go?
There was a lot of learning that went on. Ultimately, everybody was in their seats before the show started, which is where we wanted it to be. But because the new enhanced QR code, the new enhanced vaccine certificate from the province of Ontario, that wasn't out yet. You had to check vaccine statuses manually on the piece of paper and then compare that to a form of identification. And that just takes time. So one challenge with getting 3,200 people in is it's just the pure volume. If you assume that everybody was going through a single door, and let's just say you were able to check someone in 1 second, it takes longer than 1 second, but for the sake of argument, let's just say it's 1 second. That's 3,200 seconds, which is about 53 minutes. So even if so let's say it takes 3 seconds. Well, now that's 53 minutes times 3. So now it's close to 3 hours to be able to check everybody if you're doing them one at a time. So because there were so many people, everything had to be scaled up. We had to upscale the number of people checking vaccinations, upscale the number of entries into the building, and it became a big routine to try to do that. Even with that, ultimately there was still a line that went around the block, but people were patient. I think a lot of people were just happy to be out. People were complimentary. Ultimately, the line moved at a very good pace. People were always moving, but it was really great to see how the audience was kind, grateful, appreciative, and just had no issues with that line and getting into the building.
That sounds like a daunting task. Now, do you certainly foresee improvement on that process with the province's new platform that's coming out?
Absolutely. I actually, beside me, I have 17 iPod touches, and we're going to be using that as our way to scan. So we're going to just the whole process is going to be much, 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 much faster, not nearly as clunky. And as I said, there's also a lot of learning in what we had before of just how to process that many people to get them through the gates and into the venue.
Got it. Okay, so now as you said the date and people typically listen to podcasts anytime from we'll get this out as soon as we can, but people might listen to this a couple months from now, so it'll be interesting to see how things change. I would imagine they'll well as more and more people start having events, there'll be more and more events. Now, do you see for yourself? Do you see a point that you'll be able to take a breather on this, or are we going to be going on like this for a couple of years?
I don't think we'll be going on exactly like this for a couple of years. How long COVID will stick around in some way, shape, or form is anybody's guess. I'm doing some crystal ball gazing, but I would hope that come the spring, come the summer, most of the restrictions will be removed. The everything about the vaccine passport is it's not something that anybody wants to stick around longer than it needs to be. So it's going to be around for I believe a fixed time period, but ultimately it will go away. And slowly but surely, we will get back to the way things were. People's comfort level will increase with time. The more they get back out, the more they get used to being in public, interacting with their fellow human being, that sort of stuff. But it's we aren't there yet. It's still a work in progress, but we'll get there.
Awesome. Well, Matt, that's probably a good note to stop things. I want to thank you for your time coming on here, because I know that it is it's a task for you to make time for other things because you got so many other things going on. So thank you. We appreciate your time, and look forward to working with you down the road.
Great. Thank you very much, Scott.